The clocks in Prague's oldest shop do not measure time. They trap it. Every watch ticks with the last breath of someone who vanished inside. The floor grinds like teeth on bone. You enter thinking it's a repair, but the shop does not fix watches, it consumes lives. And today, it's waiting for you. The first sound was not the ticking of the countless clocks, but the slow, deliberate grinding beneath the floorboards, as if something ancient sharpened its teeth on metal. The murmur of that hidden mechanism seemed to seep through the walls long before a person touched the door, slipping into the mind like a forgotten memory waking with a start. In the far reach of Prague, in the year 1891, the clockmaker's shop stood at the edge of crooked streets and older histories, half swallowed by fog and time. The air around it felt strangely swollen, as if every gust carried the stale breath of something that had waited too long and grown tired of waiting. Travelers passing by often clutched their coats tighter without understanding why, feeling their own footsteps age beneath them, as though the very ground remembered versions of them they had not yet lived. Inside, the dust lay thick enough to soften outlines and swallow edges, yet nothing in the room ever truly rested. Even a silent object seemed poised in a held breath, prepared for the smallest shift. Dozens of clocks clung to the walls in tight clusters, their faces of brass and glass dulled by decades of handling, their hands moving out of sync in disobedient rhythms. Some advanced steadily, others trembled as though unsure whether to continue. A few hung motionless, the thin shadows of their hands cast across the uneven plaster like frozen ribs. In the dimness, it was easy to imagine that they were not measuring hours at all, but carving invisible shapes into the air, slicing minutes into shreds too fine for the human eye. The wooden boards beneath the counter bowed under a weight that logic could not explain. Every so often, the grinding sound below shivered upward, neither loud nor sudden, but with a deliberate persistence that suggested purpose. Not the whir of a machine, but the slow chew of a creature that understood patience better than hunger. Some townsfolk swore that if one lingered too long by the doorway, the grinding synchronized with the pulse in their throat, as though the floor tasted their fear and matched its rhythm. Despite the eerie solitude, the shop did not repel visitors. Instead, it enticed them with a quiet, irresistible pull, like a half-remembered promise. People brought broken watches, tarnished pocket pieces, small heirlooms inherited from relatives whose names already felt distant. They left them on the counter, believing the unseen master of the space possessed an ability beyond craftsmanship, a gift for taming not only brass, but the elusive pulse of mortality. The notion clung to the district like a superstition, whispered in tremulous voices. The clockmaker could mend more than metal. He could alter the direction of a life, tighten it, loosen it, draw it back from an unwanted edge. But each person who stepped inside felt the shift. The moment their foot crossed the threshold, the air thickened, as though it wrapped around their limbs with a gentle but insistent grip. The smell of oil and old wood seemed laced with something harder to describe, something like the scent of years pressed too tightly together. The light dimmed without flickering, as if the space itself swallowed brightness with quiet hunger. And in that strange hush, between the scattered ticks and stutters of the clocks, each visitor sensed the same impossible truth. Time within these walls did not pass. It circled, listened, and waited, coiling itself around the stranger who had dared to enter. The clockmaker greeted no one, yet customers continued to leave their broken watches and return for them several days later, only to find the shop silent and their repaired pieces placed with immaculate precision on the counter. No sign of human presence ever lingered, no footprints in the dust, no scent of another's breath, no trace of warmth on the surfaces he must have touched. The room always appeared as though someone had only just left or had never been there at all, suspended in a state between occupation and abandonment. Those who visited spoke of a peculiar sensation settling over them the moment they stepped across the threshold, a feeling that the air remembered them more vividly than they remembered themselves. In the dusty mirrors lining the back wall, the reflections behaved with the slightest but unmistakable rebellion. Movements lagged by a fraction of a heartbeat, a delay so subtle that many dismissed it as fatigue or imagination, though a deeper instinct recognized it as something far stranger. When a hand lifted, its glimmering counterpart hesitated, trailing behind by a breath long enough to turn the stomach. Some swore their reflections blinked after they did, as though the images were deciding for themselves whether to follow. The mirrors seemed thick with layered time, as if they held not one reflection but several, each belonging to a version of the observer that had lived a different number of minutes. The oddities would have remained mere curiosities had the repairs themselves not defied understanding. Watches returned from the shop did not simply tick, they breathed. Their rhythm carried a strange cadence, uneven yet undeniably organic, closer to the fragile flutter of a weakening pulse than the mechanical regularity of gears. Those who pressed an ear to the metal casing felt a faint warmth radiating from within, inexplicable in cold months when the rest of the room froze to the bone. The ticking seemed to sync with the listener's heartbeat before drifting away, pulling their own rhythm into unfamiliar patterns, as though negotiating ownership of the pace at which their blood should move. Whispers spread across the district, curling through taverns and winding along the narrow streets. Some claimed the clockmaker had mastered a craft older than Prague itself. One whispered through generations that understood time not as a line, but as a fabric waiting to be stitched, loosened, or torn. Others suggested the man had struck a bargain, exchanging something essential for the ability to manipulate the hours of others. Yet no one could describe him clearly, and many realized with a chill that they could not recall his face at all. They remembered only an impression of stillness, the faint soot mark of a shadow, the grain of silence in a room thick with ticking. When the first disappearance occurred, it unsettled the neighborhood but did not yet stir fear. A merchant left a family heirloom for repair and never returned. His absence was blamed on debt, travel, or personal choice. Pragmatic explanations smothered unease. But when the second and third customers vanished, each leaving behind a watch returned to the counter with uncanny punctuality, suspicion thickened like fog rolling in from the river. The faces of those watches carried small scratches that had not been present before, marks resembling the thin, deliberate lines of handwriting. Some observers insisted the scratches changed shape when viewed at different angles, forming symbols too intricate to belong to the random abrasions of use. Within the district, the memory of the missing individuals grew strangely faint. Names that had once been spoken daily dissolved from conversations. Neighbors remembered the shape of a coat, but could not picture the wearer. Rooms once filled by laughter or argument felt hollow, as if they had been empty far longer than the calendar claimed. It was as though the vanished had been plucked not only from existence, but from the recollection of those who knew them. Only the watches remained, ticking faintly, each beat weighted with the gravity of something that had been taken. One widow who recognized her husband's pocket watch on the counter fell to her knees at the sight of it. She reached for it only to recoil as if burned. The metal pulse within the case throbbed with an unmistakable imitation of her husband's short, uneven breathing from his final days of illness. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the ticking faltered at precisely the rate his strength had once dwindled. The watch did not mark time. It replayed the cadence of a man's departure from the world. She screamed that the clockmaker had stolen what remained of him and trapped it within the gears. But the shop, indifferent to grief, swallowed her cries with its familiar hush. More disappearances followed, and the pattern solidified into something unervingly deliberate. Each missing person had visited the shop within the final week of their life. Each had placed in the clockmaker's silent domain something precious, an heirloom, a keepsake, an object binding them to memory. And each time, without exception, their repaired watch returned precisely 3 days after their encounter, gleaming with unnatural polish, as if freshly created rather than restored. The pattern of scratches deepened into unmistakable symbols. Some swore they resembled constellations, as though mapping the distance between the vanished and those who remained. Fear burrowed deeper with each rumor, yet the shop did not lose its customers. A strange compulsion drove people toward it, an unspoken lure wound tight around their curiosity. They visited with trembling hands, whispering to themselves that their reasons were practical, mundane, harmless. They told themselves they sought only repair, only clarity, only closure. But beneath those excuses simmered a darker hunger, the desire to sense, even briefly, the place where time faltered, where life brushed the edges of something vaster, colder, more precise. Some entered to test the tales, to prove their courage or discredit the stories. They emerged pale, shaken, unwilling to speak of what they had felt pressing softly against their spine in the dimness. Others stood frozen before the door, unable to cross the threshold, yet equally unable to walk away, caught in the silent grip of something that watched without eyes. A few fled the district entirely, abandoning homes, families, and fortunes to escape the slow crawl of dread. But most returned eventually, drawn back like moths circling the faint glow of an unseen flame. The clocks within the shop seemed to sense every visitor, adjusting their rhythm in subtle shifts. Some sped up as if delighted. Others dragged their seconds as though tasting the person's presence, testing their worth. And beneath the floorboards, the grinding never ceased. It continued with calm deliberation, unfazed by fear or speculation, consuming something intangible with every slow, methodical turn. When the district finally admitted that the disappearances formed a pattern, it was already too late. The pattern had extended beyond simple vanishing, becoming a quiet rearrangement of the community's entire sense of time. People awoke feeling older, though their faces remained unchanged. The hours between dusk and dawn stretched with uneasy elasticity. Shadows clung longer to the edges of buildings, as if marking time differently from the sun. And throughout it all, the shop remained untouched, unchanged, unmoved. A quiet monument to the silent art practiced within its walls. Each repaired watch, no matter how small or humble, carried the faint echo of its owner's final breath, ticking its way through the lives of those who dared to listen. The traveler had walked far longer than he intended, worn down by the slow drain of a day that seemed to stretch without mercy. By the time he reached the outskirts of Prague, his legs trembled with fatigue, and the sky had sunk into the color of tarnished silver. The hour had slipped from his grasp entirely, dissolving into the bleary haze of exhaustion. Wandering through streets that grew narrower with every turn, he noticed a faint glow leaking through a warped window pane. Drawn by the light or by something deeper and unnamed, he pushed open the door of the clockmaker's shop without thinking, compelled by a quiet pull that felt almost familiar. The air inside thickened instantly, settling over him like a heavy garment soaked in cold water. It clung to his skin, tightened around his throat, and slowed the breath in his lungs. A strange sensation spread through his limbs, as if the room recognized him, as if the atmosphere itself shifted in acknowledgement, adjusting its weight to accommodate a presence it had been expecting. He paused, convinced for a fleeting moment that he had stepped into a place he had dreamed long ago, though the memory refused to form a clear image. Beneath the wooden floorboards, the grinding sound rose in a soft metallic sigh that carried an unsettling impression of welcome, like the exhale of a creature that had just sensed its next heartbeat. The counter at the far end of the shop seemed to glow faintly under a thin film of dust. Resting atop it were dozens of watches, arranged with unnatural precision, each one aligned perfectly with the others as though measured against an invisible ruler. Not a single piece ticked, not a gear stirred. They lay in absolute stillness, yet something about them vibrated in the edges of perception, giving the impression of movement just beyond the boundary of sound. Their hands were frozen at the same precise moment, a sliver past midnight, or perhaps a breath before dawn. The traveler narrowed his eyes, trying to determine whether the uniformity was a trick of the dimness or a deliberate arrangement with implications he did not dare articulate. A pulse of dread nudged the base of his spine when he realized he could not shake the thought that each watch was a reflection of himself. They looked identical at a glance, but as he leaned closer, subtle variations emerged, tiny scratches, faint dents, patterns of wear that felt disturbingly personal. The suspicion grew, slow and creeping, that if he turned any of them over, he would find his own name etched inside the casing. His fingers hovered over the nearest piece, trembling not from cold, but from a deeper instinct warning him that some thresholds, once crossed, could never be undone. An ache spread through his joints, familiar yet premature, as though age itself had reached for him. His shoulders slumped under a weight that had not been there moments earlier. The air pressed in from all sides, thick with the density of accumulated years, and he felt the strange sensation of something being siphoned from him in slow, invisible strands. He tried to straighten his posture, but found his spine resisting, bound by an exhaustion that felt older than his own lifetime. His breath grew shallow, not out of fear, but out of the eerie sense that the room measured each inhale with meticulous patience. Though he had not seen the clockmaker, he felt the presence with chilling clarity, an unseen gaze resting upon him from somewhere deep within the shadows. There was no sound of footsteps, no whisper of breath, no flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. Yet the awareness was unmistakable. It pressed against the back of his mind with the delicate weight of a hand laid on his shoulder. The room felt sentient, as though its walls pulsed softly with the slow heartbeat of a being that understood time not as humans did, but as a resource to be harvested. He stepped toward the counter with the unease of a man approaching his own reflection in a dream. The grinding beneath the floorboards shifted in tone, growing lighter, more curious, as though the mechanism, or creature, below had recognized the cadence of his steps. The boards gave a faint vibration under his weight, humming with something like anticipation. The sensation pulsed upward through his soles, threading into his bones with a chilling semblance of intimacy. He felt observed, evaluated, perhaps even appraised. His eyes drifted once more to the frozen watches, and he noticed something he had overlooked before. In the faintest shimmer of the dim light, he saw his own reflection captured in the glass faces. But it was not the reflection of the man he believed himself to be. The image staring back bore deeper lines across the brow, hollowed cheeks, and the sagging weariness of someone who had carried too many years. The reflection blinked a heartbeat after he did. Its lips parted in a breath he had not taken. A small, almost imperceptible tremor shook his hands as he recoiled from the counter. The room remained silent, but the silence had a texture now, thick, pulsating, patient. A realization unfurled slowly in his thoughts, one that did not belong to him entirely. He sensed that his arrival was not an accident of wandering, not a moment of chance misdirection. Something had guided him here with the subtle inevitability of a clock hand completing its circle. The shop had awaited him. The mechanism beneath the floor recognized him. And the collection of frozen watches bore witness to his arrival long before he had set foot inside. A shiver ran down his spine, not from cold, but from the chilling certainty that whatever purpose had drawn him into this place was already unfolding. The shop seemed to close around him, drawing him deeper into its quiet hunger. Though he longed to turn and flee, his feet refused to obey. The air thickened again, settling around him with possessive weight, as though the room had decided he belonged to it now. And in that moment, with the grinding beneath the floor stretching into a long, deliberate breath, he understood without seeing the clockmaker that he was not a visitor. He was expected. The traveler moved deeper into the dim shop, each footfall muffled by the thick, dust-laden air that resisted his passage like a reluctant tide. The farther he went, the more the walls seemed to lean inward, warping subtly as if bending around him, reshaping themselves in accordance with his presence. Rows of clocks lined the shelves, grandfather clocks with cracked varnish, delicate pocket watches resting on velvet, brass mantel clocks with grimacing cherubs carved along their frames. Yet none behaved as they should. Some hands lurched forward at erratic intervals, twitching like startled insects. Others crept backward in slow, deliberate arcs. A few remained utterly motionless, their faces blank, as if awaiting instruction on which direction time should flow. The cacophony was eerily quiet. There was no ticking, only the impression of ticking, a rhythm his bones felt more than heard. With each cautious step, a heaviness settled deeper into his joints. He felt it coil around his knees, sneak into the tendons of his ankles, burrow behind his shoulder blades. The ache grew not from exertion, but from an accumulation, layer after layer, of weight that had no name until it manifested as age. His breath left his lungs in warm puffs tinged with the taste of dust, dust that felt older than the building, older than Prague itself, dust that might once have been the remnants of hours devoured. He paused, shuddering, yet the stale air did not grant him relief. It thickened, tightened, and clung to his sagging posture like wet cloth. Behind the workbench stood a warped mirror, its surface rippled with age or perhaps distorted by the room's intent. Drawn despite the dread curling in his stomach, he approached it and stared. The reflection waiting for him was a mockery of his memory. Cheeks hollowed as though starved of vitality, hair thinned to wisps, eyes dulled under heavy lids, shoulders slumped as if crushed by unseen burdens. The sight anchored his breath. He lifted a trembling hand to his cheek. The reflection mimicked the gesture but lagged by the smallest, most chilling fraction of a second. It was not merely slow, it was tired. His reflection looked exhausted from the effort of keeping up with him. A monstrous realization slithered into his mind, cold and certain. Time here did not simply pass. It fed, it consumed, it drained, and the shop, with all its silent, distorted mechanisms, drew sustenance from every second siphoned from him. The grinding beneath the floorboards responded, rumbling with greedy anticipation. The vibration crawled up his legs, settling into the marrow of his bones, rattling faintly like cutlery stirred in a drawer. The sound grew rhythmic, almost loop-in, as though something in the depths measured the pace of his aging with feral hunger. He staggered away from the mirror, but the reflection did not retreat immediately. It clung to the glass, staring after him with a look of helpless resignation, as if the reflection itself could feel its dwindling time. He looked around wildly, searching for the clockmaker, begging silently for some human presence that might anchor him to the reality he feared was slipping away. But the shop offered no such mercy. Shadows moved with purpose, bending subtly in corners where the light should have held them still. The shelves seemed to pulse, their wooden frames warping like flesh shifting beneath a shallow breath. He could not tell if the room was alive or merely hosting something that was. He tried to recall his life beyond the door, where he had come from, whom he had spoken to last, how old he had been when he started his journey. But the memories fought him, slippery as mercury. He could see faint images, a long road under a pale sky, the outline of distant trees, the weight of a bag over his shoulder. But he could not place them in time. Had those moments happened earlier that day, earlier that year? Or were they remnants from decades he no longer remembered living? Each attempt to grasp his past felt like pulling at a thread that had already been cut. A panic surged within him, sharp and desperate. He sucked in a breath and forced himself to turn toward the exit. The door seemed farther away than before, its frame blurred as if seen through water. He took a step, but his knee faltered beneath him. Pain, deep, ancient, foreign, stabbed through his leg. He bit back a cry. The grinding below intensified into a steady, deliberate churn, as if urging him to surrender to the inevitable. The sensation that the room wanted him to move deeper, not escape, tightened around his throat. He whispered to himself that he had to leave, that he had to remember how old he truly was. But even as he formed the thought, doubt seeped in. Had he ever been younger than this? Had he walked into the shop as a weary traveler? Or had he been here for years, decades, centuries, gradually devoured until the memory of youth was nothing but a hollow echo? The shop's suffocating silence offered no answer. It simply watched him. His gaze fell again on the frozen watches atop the counter in the far corner. Though he was certain they had not moved, their arrangement felt subtly different now, angled slightly toward him, as though listening, or perhaps waiting for his name to reveal itself upon their backs. He felt the tug of something pulling him closer, not physically, but with the inevitability of gravity. His feet shifted toward them of their own accord, driven by a strange resignation. He stopped halfway, trembling. The grinding below deepened, vibrating through the floorboards with a pulse too deliberate to be mechanical. It felt like breath. Slow, eager, patient. A final, terrible thought tightened its grip around his mind. Perhaps the shop had not captured him on this night. Perhaps it had always owned him. Perhaps he had been part of its collection long before he walked through the door. One more life measured, rewound, devoured, and left to linger in this place where time curved inward and fed upon itself. He opened his mouth to shout, to call out for the clockmaker, for help, for mercy, but the air swallowed the sound before it left his throat. The floor trembled with a sick, rhythmic insistence, as though something beneath the boards pushed upward in slow pulses. The traveler braced himself against a leaning shelf, feeling the distinct throb of the unseen mechanism resonate up through his bones. The vibrations carried a warmth that felt wrong, like the heat radiating from a creature rather than from any arrangement of gears. His breath quivered in his chest. Then, as the dust in the room shifted with a soft sigh, he noticed the trapdoor, barely visible beneath scattered scraps of brass, bent screws, and curls of tarnished shavings. It seemed to pulse faintly in the half-light. Not a flicker of shadow, not the sway of a board loosened by age, but the steady beat of something alive. He had no memory of the trapdoor being there when he first entered. It was as though the room had rearranged itself, presenting the next inevitable step the same way a living thing might open an eye. His hands moved toward it before his mind managed to protest. Dread twisted coldly in his stomach, yet another force, whether hunger, compulsion, or the strange gravity of the place, pulled him forward. The grinding beneath the floorboards shifted to a muted whir as he brushed aside the metal scraps. The trapdoor's edges were worn smooth, as though it had been opened countless times by countless hands that no longer existed. He gripped the recessed brass handle. Beneath his fingers, it throbbed with a faint warmth. He pulled. The door lifted easily, far too easily, like something waiting to be uncovered. What he expected to see was a cramped cellar, perhaps the workshop of a reclusive craftsman. Instead, the floor yawned open, revealing a chasm that descended far deeper than the building's foundations could possibly allow. The pit was immense, carved into darkness, lit only by the dull shimmer of metal in motion. It was not a room. It was an abyss. Gears of every size turned in slow, deliberate synchrony, each tooth sliding into the next with unnatural precision. Pendulums swung in curved arcs that made no physical sense, their paths bending around one another without touching, as though each obeyed a private law of motion. The machinery stretched into obscurity, fading into layers of interlocking motion that resembled skeletal ribs, spinal coils, and the open, grinding jaws of some titanic being. Yet the movement was not chaotic. It was calculated, purposeful, living. As the traveler leaned closer, the grinding sound he had heard from above resolved into a chorus of mechanical breaths, drawn out, ancient, rasping. Something in the pit exhaled. The gust brushed his face with warmth that smelled faintly of oil and old skin. Then he saw them, reflections, or impressions, caught in the gleam of the turning gears. Fragmented faces flickered across metallic surfaces, as if glimpsed in shards of shattered mirrors. Eyes widened in the instant before recognition turned to terror. Mouths parted in silent cries. Expressions contorted just as the reflections split, scattered, and vanished into the next turning plane. The same faces reappeared a moment later, again and again, caught in an unending loop of their final moments. His pulse beat violently in his ears. These were not illusions. He felt their presence pressing against him, each fragment a memory trapped in metal, each one devoured and repurposed into this impossible mechanism. The pit was a graveyard not of bodies, but of time itself, seconds torn from lives and fused into gears, minutes stretched thin to power pendulums, hours compressed into the weight of colossal wheels. The reflections were the remnants of those who had sought the clockmaker's aid, only to be consumed when their allotted seconds were stripped from them and fed into the machinery's hunger. A sudden realization washed over him, slow, heavy, inescapable. The clockmaker had not constructed this monstrous apparatus. No human hand could have shaped such a labyrinth of impossible mechanics. No human mind could have conceived of time as something malleable, digestible, combustible. The clockmaker had long ceased to be a man. His body, his will, his identity had been subsumed into the machinery, drawn into its depths and dissolved into gears and cogs until nothing recognizable remained. All that existed now was the will of the mechanism itself, a force that bent the room above to its needs, guiding visitors toward their fates. The traveler's breath caught in his throat as a massive gear shifted below, revealing a dark hollow at its center. Within that hollow, he glimpsed what might once have been a human eye, clouded, mechanical, yet aware. It swiveled upward, locking onto him with a slow, deliberate focus. He felt the weight of its stare as though it pressed a hand to his spine, urging him to descend. The pendulums around the hollow adjusted their rhythm. The grinding deepened, echoing his heartbeat. He stumbled back from the opening, desperate to close the trapdoor, to shut away the horror beneath. But the boards around the pit vibrated, refusing to release him. The air thickened with a pressure that pushed him forward rather than allowing retreat. His muscles strained against the invisible force, but his limbs felt heavier with each passing moment. His fingers, once quick and sure, trembled uncontrollably. His breath rasped in his chest like old bellows. Behind him, the shop remained eerily silent. No clocks ticked. No wood creaked. The world above held its breath, waiting. He stared into the machinery again, unable to look away. The reflections in the gears multiplied, layering over one another like pages of different lives pressed together. Among them he saw a flicker, something that looked like himself. Older, dust-choked, hollow-eyed. The image blinked out of existence a moment later as a pendulum swept through its fragment. A terrible clarity dawned upon him. This was not merely a graveyard. It was a cradle. Each life consumed fed the mechanism, allowing it to turn, allowing it to stretch tendrils of influence through the world above, inviting new victims into its reach. The trapdoor was not an entrance. It was a threshold, and now it was open for him. He did not know whether he leaned forward of his own will or whether the room guided him. The distinction hardly mattered. The grinding rose in a slow crescendo, warm air wafting upward from the pit, stroking his face in a grotesque semblance of welcome. Far below, the hollow eye blinked. The pendulum slowed. The gears shifted expectantly. The mechanism waited for him to join it. The floor beneath the traveler seemed to pulse with intent, each tremor a measured step toward inevitability. The grinding that had haunted him for hours ceased abruptly, leaving a silence so dense that the echoes of his own heartbeat rattled in his skull. The air itself felt compressed, thickened by some unseen weight pressing down from the machinery below, a suffocating pressure that made inhalation a deliberate act of effort. The watches on the counter, once innocuous trinkets gleaming beneath the dim gaslight, now seemed sinister, their faces frozen in the pause between heartbeats. Each hand pointed not to the hour but to a memory, a final instant of a life now destined to join the pit below. He understood with a creeping horror that these were not gifts returned after repair. They were the remnants of those who had succumbed to the shop's unseen will, each tick marking the beat of a soul already spent, and now, inevitably, his own. The traveler tried to pull backward, to distance himself from the trapdoor, but the air resisted him. It was as though the room had weight and intention, guiding him forward with a force he could neither name nor resist. His limbs trembled under the compulsion, every muscle screaming against the invisible authority pressing through the floorboards. Dust stirred at his feet in lazy spirals, caught in a light that no longer shone evenly but danced with a sentient rhythm, tracing the path of his descent before his body could follow. A subtle, metallic aroma filled his nostrils, burnt oil and aged brass, with undertones of something far older, something that smelled of mortality itself, distilled and condensed into the machinery that yawned below. His stomach turned, yet the pull persisted, relentless and precise, as though the clockmaker, or what remained of him, had long ago discarded the concept of mercy. He had become part of the system, a cog in a greater design whose pattern could not be discerned but was exact, and he was now expected to complete the turn. When the trapdoor gave way beneath his weight, it did not feel like falling. Time itself folded and contorted, a pliable substance, tightening around him, pressing in like hands he could neither see nor resist. The churning gears below welcomed him, their immense teeth slicing through the perception of seconds and minutes until a single, viscous moment enveloped him entirely. He glimpsed fragments of the lives consumed before his own, faces contorted in terror, delight, or resignation, each one fleetingly visible in the glint of the interlocking cogs. Their eyes, frozen mid-expression, seemed to follow him as he sank, a silent litany of witnesses to the shop's meticulous appetite. He tried to scream, but no sound passed his lips. The silence of the mechanism had swallowed the very capacity for protest. And yet he felt, within the rhythm of the pit, the unmistakable acknowledgement of presence, the calculation of a force far beyond human comprehension. Somewhere above, the shop waited. Its windows were fogged with the residue of centuries, the wood of its frame polished by hands that no longer existed. Dust lay settled upon the counters, yet it moved subtly when no one watched, disturbed by the faint vibrations of the abyss below. Outside, the streets of Prague carried their normal morning bustle, though those who walked past the crooked wooden doors sensed an absence, a subtle quiver of the air, the almost imperceptible suggestion that the world had shifted slightly in their absence. Birds perched on nearby roofs paused in mid-call, their heads cocked as though listening to a rhythm only they could detect. Inside, all clocks ticked with uncanny unanimity, a measured, human cadence, as though welcoming the next visitor to unknowingly synchronize with the pattern of lives already folded into the gears beneath. The traveler's descent was slow, deliberate. Time stretched and recoiled, brushing against the awareness of every second of his existence. He glimpsed his own reflection in a pendulum's polished curve, older and younger at once, his face a composite of every potential future he had not lived. The sensation was dizzying and intimate. He felt the pressing weight of his own mortality articulated in the very mechanics designed to consume it. The grinding of wheels, previously a background hum, became a language, each revolution a word of command, each tick an echo of inevitability. He became aware of the faintest vibration in his bones, the resonance of machinery not merely moving, but judging, calculating, integrating him into its endless cycle. He realized that resistance was not just futile, it was inconceivable, for the pit had anticipated him long before he arrived at the door. And then, abruptly, he reached the bottom, or what felt like bottom, though the pit's dimensions defied reason. The gears slowed, accommodating his presence as though he were another element in their intricate design. Fragmented reflections swirled around him, faces of past patrons folding into one another until the line between self and consumed blurred. He saw the clockmaker there, not as a man, but as an impossible convergence of metal, pendulum, and will, an entity that had long since dissolved corporeal form in service to its eternal craft. The pit exhaled a rush of warm, metallic-scented air, brushing his skin with familiarity, and he understood, in a single, shuddering heartbeat, that he had been expected, prepared for, accounted for in every cycle of movement above and below. The watches left on the counter were not warnings, but invitations, each one measuring how close he had already come to the inevitable. When morning arrived, the shop appeared untouched. The air inside carried no hint of the horrors beneath, only the faint, measured scent of brass and aged wood. Sunlight slanted through the crooked windows, illuminating the counter, now holding a single, small watch. Its ticking was soft, deliberate, almost human. Townsfolk passing by noticed its presence and paused, though none spoke aloud of its unnerving familiarity. The shop, serene and immaculate, waited patiently for the next visitor, its rhythm imperceptible yet relentless. And within the tiny case, deep beneath the polished surface, the heartbeat continued, faint, inevitable, and unmistakably alive. The traveler's absence was not remarked upon, not mourned, yet everywhere the ticking was heard, a promise and a warning that each moment, each breath, might already belong to the pit below, and that someday it might be theirs.